Hi, I'm Bob, and welcome to Between the Sheets, where we look at Microsoft Excel and related technologies. Sometime in 2024, Microsoft will introduce two Excel functions to create pivot tables, Groupby and Pivotby. They're currently in beta, so your installation of Excel might not have them available yet. And to start with, they will be available only in the Windows version. Pivot tables are great, but they can be a little tedious to create, and their big disadvantage is that they're static. If there's a change in the source data, you have to update the pivot table manually, except when you first open the file. But functions are dynamic, so they will change immediately. The big advantage, of course, of pivot tables is that you create them visually by dragging and dropping fields, but with functions you have to enter them manually. Also, the group by function is a little quirky, and I'll show you how to deal with it. What I'm not clear on is why Microsoft created two functions. We really need only one. So let's take a look and see how it works. Here's a sheet of transactional data where a pivot table would be useful. I want to show you the group by function first. So I'm going to take this data, I'm already clicked inside it, and I'm going to turn it into a table. So I'll press Ctrl T. Click OK. Click to deselect. Formatting looks good. This is now in the Table Design tab of the ribbon bar. And the table name, I'm going to delete whatever's in there, and I'm going to call it Orders. Now, if we were to create a regular pivot table from this, we would need to decide which fields go in the rows, which numerical fields would get calculated in the main part of the pivot table, and what that calculation would be, like sum or average. So let's take a look at the syntax of the group by function to see how that function handles it. So this function looks a little complicated, but it has only three required arguments: row fields, values, and function. The rest of the arguments in square brackets are all optional, but you'll probably want to use them. Also, I'm not really crazy about the wording of the options, so I renamed them a little for you. So in those first three arguments, we decide what are the row fields, what values field are we calculating, like sales or something, like we have in our example, and then that function. So that's those three required arguments. The first optional argument is the field headers, and that means, does the source data have headers, and if so, do you want to display them? You'll see this is where the quirkiness comes in. The next option is row total depth, and that just means how do you want sub and grand totals, if any. Sort order is simply, do you want the result to be ordered by one of the resulting fields in ascending or descending order? And the last option is, do you want to filter the results? A regular pivot table lets you insert a drop-down list at the top for filtering, and this option is the equivalent to that. There won't be an actual drop-down, but this option will handle the filtering. One thing you can't do with a pivot table that you can do with this function is put the results off to the side next to the source data. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to scroll over a little bit. I'm going to scroll up here because I want to see on top of the table, and I'm going to click right there in cell L5. I'm going to put in equals group by, and notice I typed the first few letters of the function and the syntax helper comes up. If you type that and you don't see that group by come up in the syntax helper, it means it's not available in your installation of Excel. So I'm going to hit the tab key to finish that off. So the first required argument is the row fields. So what I want is the month and variety. So I'm going to put my mouse pointer up here, and you see we got this down arrow, and I'm just going to drag across month and variety. So here's where some of the weirdness is starting. You notice that, of course, we have column headers on row 5. So even though month and variety have those column headers, you notice they're not being selected. So we're going to have to deal with that. But that's okay for now. I'm going to put in a comma and ask me what are the values that I want to calculate. So that's going to be the dollar sale in column J. So again, I'm going to get that down arrow and click. So that goes in, comma, now the function. And you notice there's a whole lot of functions we can use. And there's some that are in here that are not in regular pivot tables. And here's a new one, percent of. So if you want to get percent of a whole, Now you could use that percent of function on the worksheet itself, but you really don't need to because it's just simple division. But this function is really meant to be used here in the group by function. Right now, I'm just going to use the sum function, so I'm going to hit the tab key. By the way, if you want to create your own calculations, you want to create your own functions, you could put a lambda in here. I'm not going to do that because it's going to be way too confusing for an already complicated video, but just you should know that you can put a lambda in here. So those are the required arguments. Now I'm going to put in a comma, and let me scroll a little bit so we can see what's going on here. Is do we want to show field headers? So yeah, we have field headers. I want to show them, so I'm going to choose that 3. That gets put in there. Comma. Now, total depth. That means, do I want to see totals and grand totals, subtotals and grand totals? Yeah, I want them. So I'm going to choose that one on bottom, and that puts in a -2. I don't really care that it's -2. Yeah, that's not very intuitive, but we have that little syntax helper drop down, so that's fine. That's what they mean by the total depth, comma, sort order. Now, do I want this sorted in ascending order or descending order? And also, what do I want it sorted by? Well, this function is going to create 3 columns. So I want it sorted ascending by the 3rd column, so I'm going to type a 3. So this is real important. This is column 3 of the result that this is going to create. It's not the column number of the source data, because you're looking at the source data and you say, hey, wait a minute, that dollar sale is column J, that's the 10th column, why are you putting in a 3? So just understand that. If I wanted this to be sorted in descending order instead of ascending order, I would simply make that -3. I'm going to filter this in the next step, so I'm going to leave that filter array argument out, close the parenthesis, hit enter, and there we go. So it kind of did it, but look what's happening with the headers. Even though the table, this is what I mentioned before, even though the table has headers across row 5, this group by function thinks that March and Kona are headers. That really does not make a lot of sense. So that's what I want to go fix. So I'm going to click in the cell where this function is. You notice this is one of the spill functions, so the function itself is in the upper left corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in here in the formula bar, and you see we have is looking at the orders table, and it's looking at month colon variety. So what I'm going to do is before month, I'm going to open up a square bracket, and you notice this little drop down comes up. I want that pound all. I could type that in manually, or I could double click it. Either way, close the bracket, and I put in a comma. Real important. It's very easy to forget that comma. And now I also need to do this for dollar sale. So month and variety, because I have 2 of those fields, they were already enclosed in their own set of square brackets. So when I put in pound all, that just had its own. So with this one, I've got this whole thing in outer square brackets, and then all month and variety are in their own. Not so much here with the dollar sale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a square bracket for the whole thing, and then another square bracket to put in that pound all, close that, and then on the other side of sale, right there, I have to close that square bracket. So all, and don't want to forget that comma, so this is all one unit. So inside these square brackets, I have pound all in square brackets, comma, dollar sale in square brackets. If you do this and you get some kind of error, like a syntax error, that's the first thing to check, is those brackets and those commas. So let me enter it, and now this makes some sense. So now we've got month and variety going across the top. Can stretch this out, and we have a grand total, and now we can see, oh yeah, here's the total for January, and here's the total for February, and so on. So I hope this issue with the field titles gets fixed. Now that this is working correctly, we can go and filter it. Now, if you take a look at the source data, you notice down column I, every order is either retail or wholesale. So I'm going to display only the retail orders, so I'm going to use that last optional argument for filtering. So let me go back up in there, and I'm going to click up there. Let's delete that right-hand parenthesis just for now, comma, and now filter array. So kind of like before, I'm going to go and choose type. So I hit that down arrow. It says, okay, orders type, but we already know. Got to open up one and then a second bracket, pound all, close the bracket, put in a comma, and after that type, I need to close the outer square bracket. How do I tell it it's retail? I'm simply going to say equals, and then in quotation marks, retail. So it's not case sensitive, but it has to be in quotation marks. Now I close the parenthesis, hit enter. And now I'm looking at all of the varieties grouped by month, and I'm looking only at retail and not at any of the wholesale. Okay, so this is great, a little tricky, but it's pretty good. But what if we want to use one or more fields in the source data for columns? So that's where we use the pivotby function. Let's take a look at the syntax first. So you see the syntax for pivotby is very similar to groupby. We just have a few more arguments. So this is just added a little bit. In addition to row fields, we also have column fields. And in addition to row totals, we also have column totals. And in addition to a row sort order, we also have a column sort order. And the filtration is pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to do a simple example and then a more complex example. So let me scroll over a little bit here to the right, and I'm going to start off, let's say, in P5. I want to have months across the rows and varieties down the columns, and have a total column at the end and a total row across the bottom. So let me put in the pivotby function equals, and notice when I just type the first maybe 2 or 3 letters, I get pivotby as an option, so I know it's available. I'll just tab through. So let me scroll back so I could see the source data here. And I want month, so I'm going to put that in, comma, and I want variety, right? So I'm going to have month for my row fields, variety for my column fields, comma, and in the middle of the pivot table, I want the sale amount. So we've got that in there. Let's scroll over here to where we've got that going in, comma. The function, just like before, I want to keep the sum function. Let's keep it simple, comma. And I don't need titles. You'll see that in a moment. So I'm going to choose 0 for now. So now I want grand totals. So I'm going to choose that, comma. So the row sort order. So for that, I'm going to put in row 2, comma. I want a subtotal row below each state and a grand total at the bottom. So I'm going to choose 1. So I get grand totals, comma, and the column sort order, I'm going to make that column 2. Let's end there, enter it, and check it out. This looks like a regular real pivot table. So we have the 3 months here. We have total row going across the bottom. We have the total column down on that side. Now, here's where things get complicated, is the pivotby function doesn't have a built-in way of selecting multiple fields for the rows, like a regular real pivot table does. So I need to find a way around it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the hstack function. It's also a new function. Oh, and did I mention the hstack function is also in beta? Well, if you have the pivot by function available, you also have the hstack function available. I discussed the hstack function in a previous episode, so you can watch that video if you need. What I'm going to do is click down here in cell P12, and let's run pivotby with hstack. So I'm going to say equals pivotby, and the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to nest hstack. Also, just type the first couple letters, and there's hstack, tab into it, and let's go back here, and I want to grab state, comma, and now variety. So those are both my row fields. So what I'm going to do is make sure that I close the parenthesis for hstack. So state and variety, those are both the first argument in the pivotby function. Those are both the row fields. Comma. Now column fields, I want to get month, so I'm going to choose month, and what I want in the middle, the values, like before, we want the sale amount, comma, let's stick with the sum function, no headers, and let's put in grand totals and subtotals. Now the next few arguments I'm going to leave off, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in 1, 2, 3, 4 commas just to eliminate those, and now I want to filter by wholesale. So I'm going to choose for the filter array, I'm going to choose that type. And I'm going to say equals wholesale. And close that. Now, unlike with the groupby function, I don't have to go and use that pound all to force column and row headers because these are already kind of built in. So let's enter that. And this looks good. Let me stretch out the columns a little bit. So we have our months on top. We have each state here listed. Within each state, we have the varieties that are being ordered. So it works great, but the formatting isn't, well, there is no formatting. And I find this hard to read. And the subtotal rows look just like the rows of detail, so it's kind of hard to know which is which. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply custom conditional formatting to this table. Now, I could go and just manually select, a row here, and I could go and manually select a row there, say, yeah, well, that's the subtotal, so I'm going to do that. But that's really not a good idea, because what happens if the source data changes, then that formatting goes out the window. So that's why conditional formatting is going to work better. Well, how do we do that? How do we decide what conditional formatting we want? Well, you notice that wherever there is a subtotal row, like this one, the second column, the second cell in that row is blank. So what I'm going to do is my rule is going to say that on every row where that second column is blank, we want that row to have a custom format. Now, the first instance of this is in cell Q12. Because of that, it occupies a special location. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all. I'm going to press Control A. So I have selected everything in this pivotby box. On the Home tab of the ribbon bar, I'm going to go to Conditional Formatting, and then down here towards the bottom, I'm going to choose New Rule. So in this new formatting rule, I'm going to choose the last option there, use a formula, and now I can put in the formula. So I'm going to say equals $Q $Q12. So it's going to look at cell Q12, and where that is equal to an empty cell, so I put in a double quotation mark. So because of this, Excel is just going to look at that all the way down that column. It's not going to be just cell Q12. It's going to look all the way down starting from Q12. Well, how do I want this to look? Now I'm going to hit that Format button, And maybe I will make it bold, and I will give it kind of that color for text. I'm going to go to fill, and maybe I'll choose that as the background. Click OK. There's our sample. Hit OK, and look at that. Now we have this formatted very much like a pivot table, and we can see very clearly where the subtotal is for each state. So that is much better than applying formatting manually. These are great, but I don't think they're ready to replace regular pivot tables just yet. They're more portable and compact, but you see they don't do nested groupings like pivot tables, and they don't have the same built-in visual appeal, although you can apply any formatting you want. So until next time, my name is Bob, and this has been Between the Sheets.